Okay, welcome to the first of the winter lecture series this year. This year our theme is East Hampton, the home front. And if you did not receive one of these cards, which has the lectures listed on the back, there are some on the mantle in the back of the room, so you can pick one up before you go and have it for your refrigerator or wherever to remind you of the coming lectures. Also back there you'll find this, which is a application for membership in the Historical Society. If you're not a member, we'd appreciate if you'd consider doing that because we really value your memberships. That's how we can do these free programs. When we talked about, I first talked to Richard about the theme for this year, because every year we have to come up with a new theme for a series of lectures, and I said, I can think of something for the Civil War, and I can think of something, what are we going to do for the Revolutionary War? And Richard said, I have the perfect thing. And he picked up this thesis that Leah Lebec had just given to him recently. So our speaker tonight is Leah Koncelik Lebec. Leah is a native of East Hampton, and she graduated from the Academy of Sacred Heart in Sag Harbor. Those of us who are old enough remember that place. And went on to become a professor of French literature and a writer of nonfiction. She lives in Greenwich, Connecticut, and part-time here in East Hampton, her hometown. She's a trustee of the Historical Society, as well as the Inner City Foundation of Fairfield, Connecticut. Leah will be talking to us tonight about her father's thesis, which was titled History of East Hampton, New York in the Revolution. So it should be very interesting. I'm looking forward to it, so please join me in welcoming Leah Lebec.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I had to adjust this today. Oops. Just let me know if you can't hear me. I very much appreciate that introduction. When Richard Barron's, our executive director, and Barbara Borsak, who chairs our winter lecture series, asked me if I would be interested in reading extracts or giving a summary of my father's thesis, I said I would be honored to do so, very honored. My father, some of you may remember him, he passed away in 2001, was an extraordinary man. He was a complex man. He was a pioneer who came out here in the late 1940s to build a home and a farm. He was a sailor. He ran the East Hampton Town Recreation Sailing Program for many summers. He was a craftsman who built lovely furniture with his own hands. He was a World War II veteran. He was a scholar who taught his children to value music and art and poetry. He was a father of 10. I think our family, all of us, his children, learned the meaning of the term Renaissance man before we'd even heard that term. Here he is at age 21 or so, very young, just heading off to World War II as an Army Air Force lieutenant. Back then, they didn't have a separate Air Force, so this was the Army Air Force. Over there, while he was there, he met my mother in Munich. They fell in love, and the rest is history. He loved history. He devoted a lifetime to studying it. After graduating from Georgetown's School of Foreign Service, he taught American history for decades at Bridgehampton High School. He taught Latin as well over there. And while doing so, he earned a master's degree in American history at New York University. And then he went on to earn a PhD in medieval history, again from NYU. Our father understood very well the importance of remembering those who had gone before, what they had fought for, and what they had died for. For this thesis, completed in 1960, he focused on the role that East Hampton men and women played during the American Revolution, that astonishing moment when, as he wrote, a thinly populated pioneer country was somehow able to break free from an extremely powerful empire. In these pages, we glimpse a people grappling with overwhelming forces, with powers and principalities that uprooted them dispersed them, confused them, confounded them, and in many cases, killed them. Although the work is written in a factual style, the reader, at least this reader, could not help but come away with a renewed respect, even sorrow, as the account unfolded. For this was the moment when the colonists had to make choices that may seem very self-evident now, but which at the time had to be most complex and painful. In my father's words, this was the moment when a young continent so filled with hope and promise dissolved into blood. In preparing the talk, I had to grapple with two challenges, at least two challenges. First, this is a research thesis. Just about every assertion, every statement here is backed by copious references and footnotes. I can't cite them, otherwise we would be here till midnight, but if you are interested in the original, there's a copy in the Long Island collection of the East Hampton Library. Secondly, the work was written primarily for a graduate faculty at NYU, and thus it tends to cite people and places and names and events with which the reader is expected to be completely familiar. And I, for one, needed some more context in order to understand some of the narrative. My guide in preparing the talk was then, if some citation was not immediately recognizable to me, I would insert a word or two of explanation. But please note that I'm not an expert in this domain. I have a PhD in French literature with a specialization in poetry of the 20th century. This is a little bit removed from American history. Any oversights or errors are therefore my own, not his. And if you have follow-up questions, perhaps the real historians in the room, Richard Barons and if Hugh King is here, can help. All that said, let's turn to these times. My father looked at East Hampton during the Revolutionary War through two main prisms, the Whig record and the Tory record. Before doing that, however, he established the setting by which he meant what life was like leading up to 1775 or the beginning of the Revolutionary War. He spends a whole chapter on this. I'm just going to sum up the most salient points. The town was founded in 1640 by settlers from Massachusetts, and every now and then I'll have something in the handout. Here you can look at the handout and see the original settlers, about 39 of them. They're all listed. It now includes Gardiner's Island, which had been settled the year before in 1639 by Lyon Gardner. In 1786, Governor Thomas Dongan granted what was called a confirmatory patent to these settlers, constituting them as the first trustees of the freeholders and commonalty of the town of East Hampton. The patent invested title to all property in these original shareholders, and it gave to these settlers the power of governance of the town. The Mulford and the Gardner families were among the most prominent and wealthiest families here. In 1764, more than a century after those first settlers arrived, the Reverend Samuel Buell, excuse me, I just have to take some water, a Yale graduate, who had been installed as a Presbyterian minister in East Hampton, estimated the population here as approximately 200 families. Most of them made their living through the land in the sea. Every spring, the cattle were driven on Montauk, as they said, to pasture there. To some extent, as my father discussed, religion was to function as an indicator of loyalties during the Revolutionary War. In the colonies, Episcopalians, whose origins, after all, lay with the Church of England, tended to remain more loyal to the crown. Presbyterians and Congregationalists in general were anti-authoritarian, more oriented toward the idea of a congregation making its own rules for living and worship, and thus many of them tended to side with the Whigs or the revolutionaries. In East Hampton, the situation was a bit more complicated. as usual, not quite as clear-cut. In the early 1700s, East Hampton had a church congregational until the arrival of Samuel Buell. He, along with several other ministers, established the first presbytery of Suffolk. This particular presbytery was more authoritarian than most. It vested more power and control in the minister and elders than in the flock. It frowned on separatist movements and ideas. It may have been, therefore, that Buell was somewhat torn between these two ideas, the idea of a tradition and authority, and the idea of autonomy and independence. In any case, it was probably survival, not theology or philosophy, that most strongly influenced the actions of East Hampton men and women as events unfolded. Let's first turn toward the record of the Whigs, those who at least initially chose to fight on the side of the revolution. What was going on this continent before the Revolutionary War? Until about 1763, the British had been very busy, very involved in a long, drawn-out struggle for territory and control in the New World, in the French and Indian War. As this conflict finally drew to a close, it marked the end of England's policy of what my dad called benign neglect toward the American colonies. Very heavily in debt, the mother country decided to levy a series of taxes on the colonies. These acts only succeeded in his words, arousing an independent American character, which had lain dormant since the first settlers arrived here in Jamestown in 1607. The city of Boston was an epicenter of colonial anger. Why? Because its very busy merchant class was very much affected by these taxations without representation. Bostonians decided to send a defiant message to England through the Boston Tea Party, as you remember, dumping hundreds of crates of tea into the harbor in December of 1773. King George III, whom I gather was a pretty volatile character, and his parliament responded very angrily. Immediately, they passed 4 new acts, closing the port of Boston, altering her charter, restricting the jurisdiction of Massachusetts courts, authorizing the quartering of British troops in Boston homes. The colonists were furious over what they called the coercive acts, but Britain only increased the tension by installing Governor Thomas Gage as governor of Massachusetts and sending troops to reinforce him. As this situation began to escalate, the other colonies were afire with sympathy for their brothers in Boston, and committees of correspondence were formed. These were an important first steps in the colonies' attempts to unify themselves and figure out a response to Britain's tightening reins. East Hampton was one of the first towns to form such a committee. In June of 1774, the trustees of East Hampton met under Mr. Eleazar Miller to agree on a position. They unanimously agreed. Do we have the quote? Oh, sorry, go back, sweetie. That's my son, my tech support over there. They unanimously agreed to cooperate with our brethren in this colony, to save us from the burthens we fear and in a measure already feel from the principles adopted by the British Parliament. The signers of this agreement included John Chatfield, Colonel Abraham Gardner, Burnett Miller, Stephen Hedges, Thomas Wickham, and Captain David Mulford. In September of '74, representatives from all the colonies except Georgia met in Philadelphia to form the First Continental Congress. There, they adopted several measures, including a protest to the king and an embargo. East Hampton, once again, was ahead of the curve and had already adopted its own embargo on British trade, even before one was ratified by the Continental Congress. And that this agreement, which the the inhabitants of East Hampton called an association agreement, was so strongly supported by everyone in town, speaks very well of its enthusiasm for the rebel cause, because East Hampton, as well as Boston, had a very profitable merchant trade to consider. Now, with these associations and embargoes, Britain now had to respond, again, to what it considered now, frankly, illegal action in the colonies. Governor Gage of Massachusetts decided to send his troops to capture the military supplies which were stored in the towns of Lexington and Concord. On April 19th of 75, British troops advanced on these towns. However, Paul Revere, had alerted the Minutemen, the Massachusetts militia, to the coming of the British. And it's important to keep in mind that these militiamen were very lightly armed, very lightly trained, by and large farmers, usually armed with muskets. They served sporadically as the need arose, hence the name at the beginning, Minutemen. They were not regular army soldiers because the Continental Army had not yet been formed. In any case, however lightly armed or lightly trained, they managed to mount a fierce resistance and drive the British off. Who fired the first shot at Lexington and Concord is a matter of dispute, but the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson has immortalized that moment. You remember that poem, "By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world." Many of the colonists still were holding out hope of reconciliation with the mother country, but it was becoming clear that people had to make a choice. As my father wrote, it was not possible to remain neutral. On April 29th, New York Colony signed and transmitted to all its counties a general association pledging whatever actions deemed necessary to oppose the arbitrary and oppressive acts of the British Parliament. Every male inhabitant of East Hampton capable of bearing arms, 250 men, signed this document. The text of the association agreement, the names of all the associators can be found in your handout. In this same month, April of 75, the New York colony formed its own Revolutionary Congress, later to be called the Provincial Congress. And this Congress included 6 delegates from Suffolk County, including Thomas Wickham of East Hampton. And in May, the famous Second Continental Congress convened again in Philadelphia. These terms, associations and committees and congresses, just a brief word of explanation. This were the colonists' means of organizing themselves at the beginning. At the local level, for instance, in East Hampton, you had committees of correspondence or committees of safety or associations. They in turn both communicated with the Provincial Congress and told them what was going on, and also sought help and guidance from the Provincial Congresses. Those were the colonies of New York, Connecticut, Virginia, etc. And then at the top, the Continental Congresses. Eventually, back to the gathering storm. Events now began to succeed each other in rapid succession. 2 confrontations in particular were to seriously impact the people of East Hampton. One was the siege of Boston, which began in April of 75, when New England militias surrounded the town to try to force the British out. The second began in May of 75, when the Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen, overcame British troops at Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point. Can you see? This is Ticonderoga and Crown Point, right up here. These forts represented an extremely important stronghold. Why? because this was the superhighway of the day, this Hudson Valley corridor between Canada, where the British were landing, all the way down to New York. And who controlled those forts of Ticonderoga and Crown Point was an extremely critical strategic advantage. They were to change hands several times during the course of the war. So let's look at the unfolding of both of these events, the Siege of Boston and the situation in Crown Point and Ticonderoga, and how they affected the people of East Hampton. In June of '75, General Washington took command of the newly formed Continental Army, and he took over the Siege of Boston, which was good from a strategic point of view, except the people in East Hampton watched this with growing alarm because they knew that if the British were driven out of Boston, it would likely come down the coast. And they were afraid that the next in line would be the New York colony in East Hampton, and that they would be subject to plunder by the British. The joint East Hampton and Southampton Committee of Safety sent a series of letters to the Provincial Congress of New York begging for protection. The New York Provincial Congress itself was worried about the threat of British raids and the possibility that Long Island would fall prey to the enemy. On July 31st of '75, they warned East Hampton and Southampton that British troops were indeed moving out of Boston, and that Montauk was the probable target. Excuse me one sec. The fleet did in fact land in Montauk on August 11 of '75, plundered about 60 head of cattle there, and then went on to plunder some more from Gardiner's Island. Keep in mind that the British themselves were desperate for food. Food was, and starvation and provisions were a huge part of the Revolutionary War. The British had sailed over here from England. On their ships were salt meat and dried peas. Historians have figured out that thousands upon thousands of British were to die of scurvy, not of gunshot, before the war ended. So for them, finding food was a very, very significant problem during the Revolutionary War. They were also under blockade on this continent, and it was illegal under the Continental Congress to sell anything to the British. The Provincial Congress was upset over this raid on Gardiner's Island, but it was reluctant to furnish enough troops for the protection of East Hampton. Why? Because of the intense pressure for troops up there at Ticonderoga. The British were now trying to recapture these forts, and Washington had appointed Major General Schuyler to protect them. Schuyler was calling for all troops in the New York region to report up to Ticonderoga. It's also interesting to remember that as 1775 closed and 1776 dawned, neither war nor independence had been formally declared, even though fighting had been going on for over a year. In January of '76, however, Tom Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, appeared. Its impact was immediate and volcanic. This extremely influential little pamphlet became the catalyst that spurred the colonists towards a clearer focus and ultimately towards a declaration of war. What did it do? It called for natural rights, liberty, and independence, while condemning all despotic and arbitrary law, but it was written in such an accessible style that, as my father wrote, it turned Tories into Whigs overnight. One of the observations that Paine wrote that resonated strongly with the colonists, that it was absurd for a small island, England, to think that it could rule from afar and rule despotically an entire continent. If any case, if ever there was an example of the power of the pen, it was certainly in this small tract. Back in East Hampton, people were on high alert. On March 4th of '76, the Provincial Congress again warned John Chatfield, chairman by now of the joint East Hampton and Southampton Committee of Correspondence, that General William Howe, Commander-in-Chief of all the British forces in America, had been driven out of Boston by Washington, and that there may be an attack on Long Island. Chatfield responded that 20 sail had already been seen off Montauk and begged for more protection and aid. In response, the Provincial Congress of New York sent 1,000 pounds of powder and 4,000 pounds of lead for the use of Suffolk County, and also decided to station 3 companies on the eastern end of Long Island, but a company would only include about 60 men. So this would have seemed far from adequate to the Committee of Correspondence. In April of '76, Samuel Buell wrote that another fleet had been seen off Fisher's Island and begged Congress again for at least 1 or 2 regiments to be sent out. But all the New York troops continued to be directed toward Schuyler and the Ticonderoga campaign. Again, in July of '76, the committee wrote to the Provincial Congress asking if a Jonathan Hulbert's company of East and Southampton men could possibly stay for protection and remain at Montauk. Congress granted a brief stay, but it only lasted a week or so, and then even Hulbert's men were ordered out. At this point, several families in East Hampton couldn't really take the tension anymore of thinking that the British were about to descend on them, and they began to pack up and flee to Connecticut, because as you can see, Connecticut is right there across the Sound. And it was predominantly still under Whig influence. This was to become ultimately a steady exodus. These families had very good reason for alarm. After General Howe had been forced by Washington to evacuate Boston, he decided to sail towards Halifax, Nova Scotia. I'm sorry, I should have had another map, but you could see he would go up the coast to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where the British had a base there to recoup and get some rest for his men. And from there, he decided that he would sail back, and this time he would make a run on and try to use the New York colony as a base of operations. In June, he set out from Halifax, and he sailed down to Staten Island, where he landed with about 10,000 men. 10 days later, he was joined by his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, and by early August, the British troops in Staten Island numbered 32,000 men. This was larger than the combined population of Kings County and Manhattan at the time. And as my dad wrote, this expedition was fully trained, abundantly supplied, and supported by 10 ships of the line, 20 frigates, hundreds of transports manned by 10,000 seamen. To oppose this mighty array, the Americans had 19,000 amateurs, poorly armed and poorly trained. Keep in mind that a ship of the line typically carried up to 60 big guns, and a frigate carried about 38. Even those 19,000 amateurs were split because Washington didn't know where Howe was going to land. Consequently, there were 5,000 men in the Brooklyn lines on the morning of August 27th, trying to hold back this mighty force. David and Goliath come to mind, but this time David had no chance. 2 Long Island regiments fought in this battle: Colonel Josiah Smith and Colonel Geronimus Remsons. Included in Smith's regiment was a company of Minutemen from East Hampton under Captain Ezekiel Mulford. When you have a chance later to study the names of Captain Mulford's men, which I put into your handout, you'll see how many of them, so many of them, were 17, 18, 19 years old. It's truly heartbreaking. By tracing the movements and assignments of the generals who fought in this battle, such as Brigadier General Nixon and Major General John Sullivan, my father believed that Captain Mulford's men were most likely assigned to guard the Bedford Pass or the Flatbush Pass, right around here. In any case, as he points out, it didn't really matter whether they were in Bedford or in Flatbush because they were crushed. Howe's men came up from Staten Island and surrounded them. To the north and even the west, they were able to get out behind them. And Hessians, whom, as you remember, were the Germans who were fighting on the side of the British, came up from the south. They were surrounded. After heroic resistance, most were killed or wounded or driven to surrender. On August 29th of 76, Long Island fell to British occupation. Many of those captured would suffer terribly. They were put onto very notorious prisoner of war ships in the New York harbor, where basically they starved to death. This was the largest battle of the American Revolution and the most devastating in terms of casualties and people lost. On September 1, the British Major General Delancey ordered all Long Island residents to take an oath of loyalty to the Crown. On September 12th, Washington abandoned Long Island to the enemy. East Hampton passed under General Howe's military command and Governor Tryon's civil command. Scores upon scores of East Hampton residents now fled to Connecticut. Those who chose to remain were to suffer tremendous hardships in the years ahead as both sides, Whigs and Tories, plundered them for all the grain and food, livestock, provisions, ammunition that they could possibly find. The situation was so hard in East Hampton as elsewhere on Long Island that people were reduced to begging for bread. Henry P. Hedges, writing in his 1849 History of East Hampton, gives a couple more details to this situation. Quote, "A detachment of the British forces under Major Cochrane stationed at Sag Harbor. The country still abounds with traditions of his surprising brutality, passion, cruelty. Many are the instances of flagrant injustice and merciless, uncalled-for punishments. Often the inhabitants of the town of East Hampton felt the lash by the order of this ruthless foe. He, as well as others, often imposed most onerous burdens upon the people. They were called at unseasonable times to come out with their teams and do service for the British Army. Provisions and cattle were taken, supplies levied, as the wants of the army required." As Samuel Buell wrote to Governor Trumbull of Connecticut, now you remember Governor Tryon of New York was a Tory installed by the British. Governor Trumbull of Connecticut was a Whig on the side of the Patriot cause, as they called it. As Samuel Buell wrote to Governor Trumbull, "The people are in a distressed and perplexed situation. They fear to become as a torch on fire at both ends." Amidst this fire of occupation, starvation, deprivation, which was to continue for years, there were a few sparks of resistance now and then, but by and large, East Hampton could only hang on and endure, hoping to survive. In these times, most East Hamptonites took the oath of loyalty to the Crown because obviously they were forced to do so. There is also evidence that at least a few survivors continued to join the Continental Army and to fight and die for the Patriot cause. And yet there's also evidence that at least a couple of East Hampton's most prominent residents not only suffered through the occupation as an unavoidable evil, but may have to some extent collaborated with the other side. The last part of my father's thesis looks at the Tory record in East Hampton. In July of '76, General William Howe issued a proclamation offering pardon to the loyal inhabitants of this island who would proclaim their loyalty to His Majesty's government. Few in July of '76 took that oath. After the Battle of Long Island, it was a completely different story. Colonel H.B. Livingston of the Continental Army wrote to Governor Trumbull that the people of East Hampton had universally taken the oath. This was understandable enough, but Livingston went on to describe people in East Hampton as actively aiding British troops and hindering Patriot troops, for instance, giving livestock to the British and hiding their cattle from the Patriots. If speedy means are not used, wrote Livingston, the whole county of Suffolk will be shortly up in arms against us. Indeed, so that there would be not the slightest doubt of where East Hampton's position lay, the Committee of Correspondence dissolved itself in October 21 of '76, with this declaration. We, the Committee of East Hampton in the County of Suffolk, being thoroughly convinced of the injurious tendency of our former meetings and resolutions, and willing to manifest our hearty disapprobation of all such illegal measures, do hereby dissolve the committee, and as far as in us lies, revoke and disannul all former orders and resolutions of all committees and congresses whatsoever, as being undutiful to our lawful sovereign, repugnant to the principles of the British Constitution, ruinous in the extreme to the happiness and prosperity of this country. A bit later, a very interesting letter appears. In December of '76, Governor Tryon of New York, remember he's the British governor, wrote to Lord Germain, British Secretary of State over in England, describing the situation in the New York colony. In that letter, Tryon included a letter that he had received from one Samuel Buell of East Hampton. This letter, Tryon wrote, would more fully explain the sentiments of the people of East Hampton. The letter is dated East Hampton, December 10th, 1776. The original can be found in the Office of Public Record, London. In that letter, which is very long, Buell does several things. First, he informs Governor Tryon that the proclamation about the oath of loyalty has been read in church to the townspeople. He is sure that everyone will gladly sign it. Yours by Mr. Hedges came safe to hand with the proclamation of Viscount Howes and William Howe, Esquire, which publicly read after divine worship, and which I am very sure was very universally assented to and acquiesced in, and can assure you, sir, the inhabitants honestly desire to remain in a peaceable obedience to His Majesty, and will not take up arms nor encourage others to take up arms in opposition to His authority. Secondly, he describes the precarious situation in which the town now finds itself, menaced by angry Continentals on one side, occupying British on the other, and privateers or pirates on the Sound. Thirdly, he informs the governor that Continental soldiers have just landed in Sag Harbor, the transmission of which information could not have been very helpful to the Continental soldiers. And he even seems to suggest that if he could, he would find out more about these soldiers and their plans. I assure you, sir, this moment while I am writing, I hear of a number of Continental soldiers just come into town. What number there is in Sag Harbor, I can't find out yet, nor their design. Next, he begs the governor's understanding and protection. We have great confidence in the benevolence and clemency of the king's officers, hoping that at present we may be suffered to abide in a peaceful subjection to his majesty. And then he adds these sentences. As for my own self, sir, I feel myself a subject of King George and honestly mean to act in character. I have been so active in getting the fat cattle to General Howe and have so warmly opposed the people leaving the island, etc., that I have been seized and carried down to Sag Harbor in order to be transported to the Maine, but indisposition prevented. I now stand upon a parole of honor. This sentence about the fat cattle seems to bear out Colonel Livingston's complaint that people in East Hampton were providing the British livestock and hiding them from the Patriots. But there also seems to be a suggestion that not everyone in town supported all this collusion. And Buell had already been threatened with expulsion. Finally, Buell ends with an explanation that he has been asked by the principal inhabitants in town to seek Tryon's protection, but these people have since withdrawn their request out of fear of the soldiers in Sag Harbor. I was greatly importuned by the principal inhabitants in town to wait upon His Excellency at this time for the same purposes, but 'tis not thought safe. The gentlemen that before urged withdrew their petition this evening, since they heard of the coming of the Continental soldiers. And now, sir, I am not without fears. This letter will be stopped before it goes out of town. You will excuse me if I subscribe, sir, yours, etc., incognito. Unfortunately for Buell's attempts to remain anonymous, however, Governor Tryon had added a line at the bottom of the letter. It read, "The above written by the Reverend Mr. Buell, Presbyterian minister for the Township of East Hampton, a favorer of the rebel rank until converted by the victory of the 27th of August." Whatever Buell's words or actions during the Revolution, my father took great care to point out that if one looks at the sum total of a man's life, not just his actions under duress, Buell must be commended for his devotion to the people of East Hampton. It was clear that he was doing everything in his power to protect them. And of course, he will be remembered for founding this Clinton Academy, not only one of the first preparatory schools in the state of New York, but also very, very progressively for its time, coeducational. But back to this letter, who were the principal inhabitants to whom Buell refers in this letter to Tryon? It's highly likely that one of them was Abraham Gardner, someone who was very active in the affairs of the town and someone whose loyalties, unfortunately, were often called to question in the aftermath of the Battle of Long Island. Just a word about these two families, the Buell and Gardner families, very, very prominent in East Hampton, but also united by marriage. Samuel Buell's daughter, Jerusha, had married David Gardner, sixth proprietor of Gardner's Island, and David and Jerusha had a son, John Lyon Gardner, who is thus Buell's grandson. David died early at the age of 36, and therefore Abraham Gardner, his uncle, was thereafter named executor of the Gardner estate. Abraham Gardner was thus the titular head of one of the wealthiest families in town. And he was also, according to several historians, an active Tory. The historian Lorenzo Sabine, in his biographical sketches of loyalists of the American Revolution, written in 1864, lists Gardner as a Tory from East Hampton. But as my dad pointed out, he didn't offer any definitive proof of that. Nevertheless, Abraham's name keeps cropping up in various accounts and documents of the period, implicating him as someone who was actively helping the British. First, he was suspected of colluding with British commanding officer Abijah Willant. When Willant landed on Gardiner's Island, he was the one who landed on Gardiner's Island back in 75, August of 75, to plunder the cattle. After that raid, a letter surfaced, unaddressed, but signed by Willant, appearing to fulfill a promise to someone on the island to render an account of the livestock taken. Since Gardiner was in charge of the island, it was he who came under suspicion as being the recipient of this letter. Gabriel. As we have got loaded all the vessels, I can't come to your house according to the promise. I send you account of all I have gotten off your island: sheep, 823, fat cattle, cows, calves. One of the calves got away. The cheese I will take account of. Send me some pigs, fowl, potatoes, and keep in mind that issue about food and starvation. And when you come to Boston, I will secure your interest to you, if in my power. I am sorry it is not in my power to come to your house, but so good a wind. He means we have such a good wind now that we can't stay. Sir, I am yours, Abijah Willant, August 1175. Clearly, the references to your house and your island reinforce the suspicion among East Hampton's patriots that it was Abraham Gardiner who was the intended recipient of the letter. Gardiner fought that charge, and the Joint Committee of East Hampton and Southampton cleared his name. But then again, the following year, he was in trouble. On May 4th of 76, the Committee of Safety ordered all disaffected persons, otherwise known as loyalists, to give their arms to Colonel Livingston. Abraham Gardiner was one of those arrested by the Continental Army. And again, he was arrested in connection with an arms raid in December of 76. And it did not help his reputation that he sheltered in his home for several weeks out here in East Hampton, Major General Andre, just before both Andre and Benedict Arnold were discovered to be plotting with the British to take over West Point. Did Gardiner know of these plans? My dad traced several documents indicating that he may have, but he also indicated that there was nothing truly definitive in those documents. And so he ended his discussion on Gardiner by saying, Colonel Gardiner died in 1782, and with him the answers to many questions. In conclusion, my father notes that it is obvious that East Hampton played a creditable role in the Revolutionary War. One glance at that roster of young East Hampton men who gave their lives to this cause affirms forever that statement. It is equally obvious that for most, resistance ended with the Battle of Long Island. It also seems that among those who suffered under the yoke of occupation, there were at least a few active collaborators. But as my father notes, whatever the conclusion may be about the patriotic zeal of some of the townsmen, it must be tempered with a large measure of sympathy for their suffering. Plundered by both sides as they were, there was little opportunity for heroism, and perhaps only enough for survival. My father goes on to quote the historian Wilbur C. Abbott, writing in New York in the Revolution, who calls the depredation of the citizens of New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, and Long Island the darkest chapter of the war for American independence. And yet, out of that dark chapter and all the chapters of the American Revolution come two of the noblest documents in our nation's history, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. I hope we never forget the struggles and the sacrifice that produced them. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions for Leah? Anybody have any questions? If Leah can't answer, then maybe someone else can.
I'll answer questions on my dad's thesis, but
Well, thank you so much. Oh, did you have a question?
Say East Hampton, you incorporate Bridge Hampton and say Harbor as well, or pretty much just this town?
Well, the committee of correspondence that my dad discussed was primarily Southampton and East Hampton. And then, of course, Sag Harbor was a very active port where most of the people who fled to Connecticut departed from the wharves of Sag Harbor.
Yes.
I just have a comment. I would hope that you would record this at some time so it will become part of the historical record.
It is being recorded, LTV. Yeah.
Thank you.
LTV does all our lectures, and you can actually buy them at LTV, get copies of them, or through the Historical Society. We have them in our collection, and we're happy to get copies to you. Anybody else a question for Leah? Leah, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I just want to remind you that in February 27th, the Spanish-American War, what was going on in Montauk and Camp Wyckoff at that time, so I hope to see you then. Thanks for coming.
Yes.